For about 2 hours, the lights went out near Iran's only operating nuclear power plant. Not because of a grid failure, not because of a maintenance issue or a weather event or any of the other explanations that Iranian state media has been issuing with institutional regularity every time something explodes in an inconvenient location at an inconvenient time. The lights went out because a United States bomb found a power substation sitting a stone's throw away from Bandar Bushehr's nuclear facility, made a very specific point about what is currently on the table, what has always been on the table, and what the Trump administration is now willing to say out loud in a Truth Social post that reads less like a diplomatic communication and more like a countdown. From this point forward, anytime the Islamic Republic of Iran shoots at a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, whether by missile, rocket, drone, or any other device or weapon, the United States will bomb and destroy one bridge or power plant, including those located next to or in the capital city of Tehran. Read that statement one more time. Not for what it says about the Strait of Hormuz, which is the tactical framing, for what it says about Tehran, which is the strategic message, the capital city where the mullahs have retreated, the last political stronghold where Golibaf and Pezeshkian and the remaining leadership architecture of the Islamic Republic have concentrated themselves after watching their military infrastructure dismantled across 11 consecutive nights of American strikes. Trump is telling them directly that last fiefdom is now a target set. Every ship you fire at in the strait costs you a bridge or a power plant in the city where you live. The restoration crews near Bushehr had the lights back on within hours. But the message was not about the electricity. The message was about what comes next if Iran fires again, and what that next thing will look like when it lands inside the capital of a regime that has spent 47 years telling its population that American power cannot reach it. And simultaneously, the IRGC responded to 11 nights of systematic military destruction and the explicit threat of Tehran-adjacent strikes by announcing a potential ground invasion of Kuwait. That combination, a superpower aiming its next strike at the capital city of an adversary, and that adversary responding by threatening to march an army through a neighboring country, tells you exactly where this conflict has arrived. It has arrived at the place where rational strategic calculation on the Iranian side has been replaced by something else, by institutional desperation, by the specific kind of threat generation that emerges from an organization that has exhausted its credible military options and is reaching for extreme scenarios, because extreme scenarios are the only remaining rhetorical territory that its own domestic audience has not already heard and dismissed. But let's back all the way up, because to understand what the Bushehr power substation strike means, and why Trump's public statement about Tehran bridges and power plants represents a qualitative shift in the signaling architecture of this conflict, rather than simply another escalatory step. You need to understand the specific logic that has governed American targeting decisions throughout 11 nights of strikes, and why crossing the boundary to infrastructure adjacent to a nuclear power plant changes the strategic conversation in ways that nothing that came before it has fully produced. 11 consecutive nights of American strikes have followed a visible internal logic that has been consistent from the first night to the 11th. The campaign began at the coast and worked inward. It began with the military systems most directly responsible for the IRGC's maritime harassment campaign, the radar networks, the coastal surveillance infrastructure, the fast attack boats, the anti-ship missile batteries, and progressively expanded its target categories as each layer of Iranian military capacity was addressed. Air defense systems blinded, command and control networks severed, underground missile cities in Tabriz struck, port control towers destroyed, railway bridges cut, petrochemical production facilities hit, the Chabahar bypass eliminated, bridges around Bandar Abbas removed. The campaign has been systematic in a way that reflects a targeting list developed over an extended period and executed in a sequence that reveals a deliberate strategic logic about which capabilities to eliminate in which order. The Bushehr power substation sits outside that established sequence. It is not a military system. It is not a command node. It is not a weapons storage facility or a logistics hub or a radar installation or any of the other target categories that have characterized the first 11 nights of strikes. It is civilian infrastructure, the electrical grid that powers a city, and in this specific case, infrastructure in immediate proximity to Iran's only operating nuclear power plant. Striking it is a message about targeting philosophy rather than a tactical military achievement. It is the campaign communicating to every level of Iranian leadership. There is a category of target we have been choosing not to strike: the civilian infrastructure that keeps Iranian cities functioning, and we are now demonstrating that the choice not to strike it was a policy decision rather than a capability limitation. The lights came back on in 2 hours. The decision about whether they come back on next time is contingent on what the IRGC does in the Strait of Hormuz. Trump's Truth Social post made that contingency explicit in language that requires no interpretation. This is not the ambiguous signaling that characterizes most diplomatic communication in active conflicts. This is a direct, named, publicly stated conditional. Shoot at a ship, lose a bridge or a power plant in Tehran. The specific naming of Tehran as the location where future infrastructure strikes will occur is the element that elevates this statement above standard military deterrence communication. Tehran is where the regime's political leadership has concentrated. Tehran is the city whose infrastructure the leadership depends on for its own operational continuity. Tehran is the place that previous American targeting has been most careful to approach without striking directly. The air defense systems over the eastern districts have been addressed. The Parchin complex just outside the city has been struck. The symbolic weight of the capital has been acknowledged through the consistent geographic limit that previous strike packages maintained. That limit has now been publicly and explicitly removed. The next ship struck in the strait cost Tehran a bridge or a power plant. The President of the United States said so, by name to the public with his signature. The IRGC's response to this declaration was delivered by Brigadier General Mohammad Akamnia, the Iranian army spokesperson, on Iranian state television. He said that if America occupies Iranian territory, Iran will bomb its own territory. Read that statement for what it actually reveals, rather than what it is intended to communicate. A military organization that threatens to destroy its own infrastructure to prevent an adversary from capturing it is not communicating strength. It is communicating the specific kind of defensive desperation that emerges when a command structure has concluded that denial, preventing the adversary from using captured infrastructure, is more achievable than defense, preventing the adversary from reaching that infrastructure in the first place. Threatening to bomb your own territory is the last resort of a force that no longer believes it can defend that territory through direct military means. It is the scorched earth doctrine applied domestically, and its utterance on state television communicates to every Iranian watching that their own military leadership has concluded the country cannot be defended through conventional military operations. Meanwhile, while the Bushehr substation was dark and CENTCOM was completing its 11th consecutive night of strikes and the IRGC spokesperson was threatening self-destruction on state television, the Iranian government was executing protesters. An 18-year-old and a 23-year-old convicted in a mass trial in which 12 defendants shared a total of 1 hour of court time between them. Not 1 hour each, 1 hour combined. 12 human beings facing capital punishment for their participation in protests that began because they could not afford food and medicine and were watching their healthcare system collapse. And collectively, they were afforded 1 hour to make whatever case 60 minutes would allow before court that had already written the verdict before the defendants spoke. The whiteboard behind them said guilty before the proceeding began. This is not a side note to the military operational picture. This is the operational picture. A regime that must execute 18-year-old protesters to hold its own streets while simultaneously threatening to invade Kuwait is not negotiating from strength in any theater simultaneously. The executions tell you something about the domestic control situation that the IRGC's operational posture in the Gulf does not. They tell you that the regime's grip on its own population is tight enough to still carry out sentences, but brittle enough that it believes it must continue executing people who protested in January to prevent the streets from erupting again now. The correlation between escalating domestic repression and deteriorating military operational capability is not coincidental. Both are symptoms of the same underlying condition: a regime under compound pressure in every domain simultaneously, managing a closing window of control by applying maximum force in the only domain where it still has decisive advantage over its own population. Now, let's talk about the hardware executing the 11th night of strikes, because the platform picture has evolved in ways that carry specific operational significance for understanding how the American campaign is sustaining the tempo it has been maintaining across 11 consecutive nights. The F-18E and F-18F Super Hornets launching. Off the Abraham Lincoln are the visible documented face of the carrier air wing's contribution to the strike package, single-seat and dual-seat variants respectively, the latter carrying a weapons systems officer in the rear cockpit to manage the targeting complexity of night strikes against diverse target sets across a wide geographic area. The footage of F-18s blasting off the carrier deck, the CENTCOM released documentation of nighttime carrier operations at sustained tempo across 11 straight nights, represents something that deserves its own analytical acknowledgement. The carrier air wing is maintaining an operational pace that puts real stress on maintenance cycles, aircrew rest requirements, and the logistics infrastructure of sustained combat operations from a floating airbase. That the pace has been maintained for 11 nights without a confirmed American aircraft loss to Iranian air defense is a statement about both the degraded state of Iranian defensive capability after 11 nights of SEAD operations and the professionalism of the air crew and maintenance personnel making it happen. The mobile target problem, the trucks, the radar dishes on mobile platforms, the launch vehicles that can drive out of concealment, fire, and drive back in, is where the most interesting platform evolution in the current campaign is occurring. Mobile IRGC assets represent a fundamentally different targeting challenge from fixed infrastructure. A command center has a known address. A radar truck has a route. Catching mobile systems requires persistent surveillance that can track movement across time, queuing targeting solutions that can be passed to strike aircraft quickly enough to engage the system before it relocates again, and the kind of real-time intelligence fusion that turns a surveillance asset's observation into an actionable targeting package within the engagement timeline that matters. The concept of manned-unmanned teaming, the pairing of autonomous collaborative combat aircraft with human-crewed F-18s, represents the technological development that makes the mobile target problem progressively more solvable. The design intent behind systems like the XQ-58A, Valkyrie, and Shield AI's autonomous platforms is precisely the scenario the Gulf presents: contested airspace with degraded GPS due to Iranian electronic warfare efforts, requiring autonomous operation without constant human controller contact, with the autonomous platform running forward into the most contested airspace while the human aircraft maintains standoff range for the mission command function. The autonomous platform passes AI-generated targeting solutions back to the crewed aircraft, which has the judgment and authorization to decide whether to act on them. The combined system produces a targeting cycle that is faster than a purely human process and more discriminating than a purely autonomous one. Whether this specific teaming architecture is operational in the Gulf right now is not confirmed in public reporting. What is confirmed is that the environment the Gulf presents, electronic warfare jamming, mobile targets, contested airspace, sustained tempo requirements, is the exact environment the architecture was designed for. The Chinese satellite targeting data component deserves specific attention because it introduces an external variable that most analysis of the Gulf conflict has been treating as a background consideration rather than an active operational factor. Reports indicate that Chinese commercial satellite firms have been providing updated targeting coordinates to the IRGC, giving Iranian maritime harassment assets the precision targeting solution against commercial vessels in the Strait that the IRGC's own degraded sensor infrastructure increasingly cannot generate independently. A mobile launcher that drives out of a hillside bunker, connects to a commercially provided targeting coordinate from a Chinese satellite, fires at a ship in the Strait, and drives back into concealment before counter battery can respond. That is not the IRGC operating in isolation. That is the IRGC functioning as the triggering mechanism for a targeting solution provided by a country whose official position is that it is not a party to this conflict. The destruction of those mobile launchers by CENTCOM strikes is the operational answer to that architecture. But the intelligence implication that Iranian targeting precision in the Strait is being partially sustained by external commercial satellite data is the detail that changes the strategic analysis of why Iranian maritime harassment has continued at the level it has despite 11 nights of strikes against the IRGC's own sensor and surveillance infrastructure. Now, let's examine the Kuwait invasion threat with the analytical seriousness it deserves, which is different from the operational seriousness it deserves, because the distinction between those two categories is the entire analytical point. Iran shares no land border with Kuwait. Any ground force movement toward Kuwait must route through southern Iraq, crossing territory where American intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets maintain persistent coverage. United States forces in Kuwait number approximately 13,500 personnel concentrated in installations that represent some of the most capable and prepared defensive positions in the American military's regional footprint. The notion that an IRGC ground force, moving through southern Iraq under continuous ISR coverage, across open desert terrain, against 13,500 American troops, supported by the full weight of American air power, operating from multiple regional bases and carrier strike groups, would constitute a credible military operation rather than a catastrophic intelligence gift. To American targeting packages requires a suspension of operational reality that the available evidence does not support. But the analytical question that matters is not whether the invasion is militarily viable. It is why the IRGC is saying it at all. Threatening a ground invasion of Kuwait serves a specific function within Iranian domestic politics that has nothing to do with its military feasibility. It generates the appearance of offensive capacity at a moment when every piece of confirmed operational reporting demonstrates defensive collapse. It gives Iranian state television something to broadcast that reads as strength rather than the documented reality of 11 nights of systematic military destruction. It activates the specific register of revolutionary rhetoric. The Islamic Republic as a force projecting power outward rather than absorbing punishment inward that the regime's domestic narrative requires to prevent the internal political situation from accelerating past the point that executions alone can manage. The Kuwait invasion threat is not military signaling. It is domestic audience management dressed in military costume, and understanding it as such tells you more about the regime's internal political condition than any IRGC operational briefing would. The videos circulating online of IRGC equipment moving toward the Iraqi border near Kuwait are real videos of real equipment. What they represent operationally is the question that requires the analytical discipline to hold separate from what they appear to represent visually. Equipment moving toward a border can mean many things. pre-positioning for a genuine offensive option, signaling designed to create defensive uncertainty in the adversary, relocation of assets away from areas that have been struck and toward areas that have not yet been targeted, or the kind of visible military activity that generates the footage Iranian state media needs to sustain the appearance of operational capability. American ISR assets monitoring every vehicle moving in that corridor are not guessing at the answer. They know. And the American military response to an IRGC ground force actually crossing into Iraqi territory in the direction of Kuwait would look like what the Brigadier General described as a potential outcome. Iranian ground forces in the open desert under persistent surveillance, engaged by air power that has been operating freely in Iranian airspace for 11 nights and would face no meaningful constraint against targets presenting themselves in open terrain. The strategic picture that Trump's Tehran infrastructure threat and the Bushehr substation strike together produce is the clearest signal yet about where the campaign's logical endpoint sits, and about how the decision to approach that endpoint is being communicated to the regime that still has the capacity to make decisions about its own behavior. The message is calibrated in a specific way that requires the regime to maintain two simultaneous realizations. First, the current tempo of strikes is not the maximum available. Second, the specific trigger for expansion to the next category of targets is Iranian action in the Strait, and the cost of that trigger is now explicitly named as Tehran's own infrastructure. This is a deterrence communication, but it is deterrence communication of a different character from anything that has been deployed previously in this conflict. Previous deterrence communications said, "Stop what you are doing, or we will continue what we are doing." This one says, "Stop what you're doing, or we will do something qualitatively different that affects the specific geography where you live and operate." The distinction matters because it changes the political cost calculation for Iranian leadership in a way that previous deterrence communications have not. Strikes on coastal military infrastructure impose operational costs on the IRGC. Strikes on bridges and power plants in Tehran impose costs on the political leadership personally and on the population they depend on for the appearance of domestic legitimacy. A regime that cannot keep the capital's lights on, that watches its bridges fall while American presidents announce publicly that each straight attack costs another one, is a regime whose domestic political narrative is being destroyed from outside in a way that is visible to every Iranian in Tehran who experiences the consequence. Now let's examine what the three simultaneous pressure tracks look like at this specific moment of the conflict, because the convergence has reached a configuration that the Bushehr substation strike and the Tehran infrastructure threat together define in ways that are qualitatively different from the previous weeks of escalation. The military track has produced 11 consecutive nights of strikes across an expanding geographic range. Kerman, Shiraz, Tabriz, Isfahan, Chabahar, Bandar Abbas, Bushehr. The target geography now spans the full north-south and east-west dimensions of the Iranian territory. Mobile systems are being found and destroyed before they can relocate. Underground drone storage that the IRGC posted video of one morning was destroyed by the following morning. The surveillance architecture watching Iranian military movements has reached a level of fidelity where the gap between the IRGC displaying a capability and American forces destroying it has compressed to hours. The IRGC is not operating under the assumption that its mobile assets are safe, because they are mobile. It is operating under the knowledge that mobility reduces but does not eliminate targeting exposure, and that the surveillance architecture overhead is persistent enough to resolve that exposure eventually. The financial pressure track has reached a terminal configuration from which no recovery is possible without a political resolution. The Chabahar bypass is destroyed. The railway bridge to Mashhad is cut. The Karun petrochemical facility is gone. The sanctions waiver that allowed oil-to-dollar conversion has been revoked. The Strait of Hormuz is operating at a fraction of normal commercial traffic under the combined weight of American naval blockade enforcement and the security risk that makes commercial operators unwilling to send vessels into the area, regardless of what theoretical protections might be available. Every pathway through which the Iranian economy generates the revenue that sustains the regime's military and political operations has been simultaneously eliminated. The regime is executing protesters with one hand and watching its economic infrastructure be methodically dismantled with the other, and neither activity is generating the outcome that would allow the other to stop. The psychological pressure track has entered the phase that the Bushehr strike most clearly signals. The phase where the regime's leadership is being made to understand, through operational demonstration rather than diplomatic messaging, that the physical safety of the specific geography they inhabit is contingent on their behavior in the Strait of Hormuz. The supreme leader who could not attend his father's funeral, the named brigadier generals being killed in inland cities, the IRGC spokesperson threatening to bomb Iran's own territory. The executions of teenagers for January protests being conducted simultaneously with state television broadcasts about Kuwait invasions. All of it together describes a regime that is managing its internal political situation with diminishing tools, while the external military pressure removes its operational options one by one. The LaGuardia Manpads alert that appeared in reporting during this same period is the dimension of this conflict that carries the most ominous potential implications for the American domestic security picture, even as its immediate operational significance remains uncertain. A Manpads, a man-portable air defense system, a shoulder-fired missile, capable of targeting aircraft in the approach and departure phase of flight, reported near Terminal C of a major American international airport during the period of peak conflict intensity in the Gulf, represents exactly the category of escalatory Iranian threat that American domestic security agencies have been preparing for since the conflict began. The Port Authority police assessment was that the specific report was non-credible. The response to a non-credible threat of this type is still the mandatory issuance of an alert to aircraft in the approach phase, because the cost of treating a non-credible Manpads report as real and slightly disrupting commercial operations is vastly lower than the cost of treating a credible one as non-credible and getting the assessment wrong. The alert was issued, the landing aircraft were warned, the landing continued. Now, the police investigation determined non-credibility. But the context in which a Manpads alert at LaGuardia registers differently from a Manpads alert in a period of strategic calm. The Islamic Republic has a documented history of attempting to project violence outside its borders through proxy networks and direct action, the assassination plots against American officials, the targeting of Iranian diaspora voices, the operations against perceived enemies of the regime on Western soil. A conflict in which the regime's military infrastructure is being systematically dismantled, and its supreme leader cannot appear publicly in his own country, does not produce an Iranian government that is less interested in projecting violence outward. It produces one that has more motivation to demonstrate reach and impose costs in domains where its conventional military has been neutralized. The Manpads alert was assessed as non-credible. The category of threat it represents is not theoretical. The honest assessment of where this specific operational picture sits. The Bushehr substation dark for 2 hours. The Tehran infrastructure threat publicly stated. The Kuwait invasion rhetoric filling the gap left by Iran's depleted military credibility. The protesters being executed in the background. Is that the regime is demonstrating through the combination of its actions and statements exactly the analytical verdict that the campaign's architects would have written in advance as the desired outcome of sustained compound pressure. The executions tell you the regime is still governing, still capable of exercising lethal authority over its own population, still maintaining enough internal security apparatus to find, arrest, try, and kill political opponents, even during an active military campaign being conducted against it from outside. But they also tell you the regime is governing through escalating coercion rather than through political legitimacy, which means the social compact that keeps a population accepting governance rather than rejecting it is being held together by fear rather than consent. Regimes that depend on executions to maintain street control during military crises are not operating from political strength. They are operating from political fragility managed through terminal force. The IRGC's Kuwait invasion threat tells you the regime is still producing rhetoric at full volume, still capable of generating the kind of maximalist statement that its domestic and regional audiences expect from a revolutionary institution that defines itself through defiance. But it tells you the rhetoric has lost its operational anchor. Threatening to invade a country you share no border with, across terrain that American ISR watches continuously against forces prepared specifically for that contingency, that is not military communication. That is the specific kind of institutional performance that organizations produce when their operational capability has collapsed below the level required to back their rhetorical posture with credible force. Trump's Truth Social post, telling Tehran that the next straight attack costs them a bridge or a power plant in their own capital, tells you the American side of this conversation has concluded that the deterrence architecture operating before this statement was insufficient to change IRGC behavior in the Strait, and that the specific contingency that might produce behavioral change is raising the personal cost to the political leadership, rather than the institutional cost to the military organization. The IRGC commanders in the Strait have demonstrated across 11 nights that they will absorb military punishment on behalf of their institution. Whether the political leadership in Tehran will absorb punishment on behalf of the Strait commanders, whether Golubov and the political figures who have retreated to the capital will accept bridges and power plants falling in their city because the maritime commanders are still firing at ships, is the question that the Trump statement is designed to force to a decision point inside the Iranian political system. The answer to that question determines everything about the next phase of this conflict. If the political leadership in Tehran can exert sufficient control over the IRGC's maritime commanders to stop the Strait attacks in order to protect Tehran's infrastructure, the deterrence communication has worked, and the next diplomatic window becomes meaningful. If the maritime commanders have enough institutional autonomy to continue Strait operations, regardless of what the political leadership in Tehran prefers, if the shadow generals, who control the fast attack boats and the coastal missile systems, are making operational decisions that the nominal political leadership cannot reverse, then the Trump statement will be followed by Iranian Strait activity, and the Strait activity will be followed by Tehran infrastructure strikes, and the political cost of that sequence will eventually produce either a political change inside Iran or an acceleration of regime collapse. The Bushehr lights came back on in 2 hours. The reactor, the nuclear power plant that every serious analyst and every serious government has been watching throughout this conflict as the line whose crossing changes the character of what this is, was not struck. The substation outside it was struck. The message embedded in that specific targeting choice is legible to anyone paying attention. We can reach the reactor. We chose the substation instead. The substation is the demonstration. The reactor is the statement about what comes after the next ship in the Strait. The IRGC posted video of its underground drone storage. The next morning it was in flames. The IRGC threatened to invade Kuwait. 13,500 American troops are positioned and ready, along with the air power that has been operating freely over Iranian territory for 11 nights. The new supreme leader could not attend his father's funeral. The lights near Bushehr went out for 2 hours, came back on, and the message they carried when they went dark is still reverberating through every Iranian command structure still capable of receiving signals. The next Strait attack costs Tehran a bridge or a power plant. The president said so publicly. The substation strike was the proof of concept. And the IRGC is now the organization standing between the political leadership retreating in Tehran and the statement they read on Truth Social about what happens the next time an Iranian weapon finds a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. Whatever decision that produces inside the regime, whatever internal calculation the combination of that statement and that substation produces in the rooms where Iran's actual decision-making happens, will be the most consequential thing to happen in this conflict since the GBU-57 found Fordo. The lights went out. The restoration crews turned them back on. And the question that is now hanging over the entire region is whether the people who ordered the strike will find a reason to let them stay on, or whether the next ship in the Strait makes the answer to that question the most expensive lesson the Islamic Republic has ever received.